All right, so I got a little bit of an update for you guys here on this clusterfuck of an infrastructure bill that we have been trying to keep up with. And listen, this has been an absolute shit show in the last couple of days. So I made a video the other day where I was basically talking about how Joe Biden's plan to have a dual-track infrastructure plan put forward has completely fallen apart basically already. And so just a little recap of where exactly we are right now and how this is going to move forward. So originally Joe Biden, he put forward his $2 trillion plan. It was $2 trillion over 8 years. I've said many times over and over and over again, this is like nowhere close to good enough. It's not what the scientists are estimating that we actually need to invest in things like climate infrastructure. It's nowhere close to what the American Society of Civil Engineers estimates that we need, which is about over $1 trillion per year over the next 5 years in order to bring our infrastructure up to a grade of a B+. I've said these things over and over again. So his original $2 trillion plan is nowhere good enough by itself. Then he decides, I'm going to work with Republicans on this. And the strategy that he comes up with to work with Republicans on this infrastructure plan is let's split it into two parts. And we're going to have the first part be a bipartisan one, and we're going to work with Republicans on that. And then they doled out this plan. And listen, the plan that they came up with in the bipartisan structure is absolute dog shit. Okay, that's the only way I can describe it. It's basically just a privatization scheme where the way that they end up paying for these bills, they're not paying for it by taxing billionaires or taxing corporations. They're paying for it with bullshit programs like asset recycling, where they basically sell off old infrastructure to pay for new programs. Completely failed ideas that have failed in other countries like Australia, and it's basically just a privatization scheme that's a totally dog shit bill that honestly is not even worth passing. But the idea was we'll get this bipartisan one done, and then we'll tie that together with a partisan one that the left will be somewhat happy with. And listen, this plan in and of itself could have maybe worked if they were serious, and Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden came out and they said, we are not going to vote for the first bipartisan package unless it's tied together with the second package that's actually good and filled with the stuff that we want. Now, they originally came out, they said, we're not going to do one bill and then hope that the next one passes magically. They have to come to the desk at the same time. Now, because Republicans got upset about that plan, they've completely walked back and completely dropped that entire plan entirely. So basically, we have a situation now where it looks like they're trying to push the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which is a shitty, watered down, not worth passing bill, and they're going to pass this basically by itself and then hope that Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema will feel motivated enough to then go work on a partisan bill that's going to include everything that the left wants. And they expect us and the squad to just fall in line and take their word for it, that if we help them pass this bipartisan shitty infrastructure bill, that they're going to be there to have our backs on the good bill. Now, this is delusional, okay? That obviously would not happen. Kyrsten Sinema, Joe Manchin would never get on board with a substantive partisan bill that is going to include all of our priorities. They would never get on board with that unless they knew that that was the only way you're going to be able to pass infrastructure at all. And so thankfully, I think some members of the squad and members of the left in Congress are recognizing this, that this is a bullshit ploy that they are trying to use in order to pass a shitty bipartisan watered down bill and then follow that up with probably another shitty Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema watered down bill. And so here's what we have. Ilhan Omar says progressives are ready to withhold votes from bipartisan infrastructure deal. So thank God, right? This is exactly what we have been advocating for the squad to do for months and months and months now. Withhold your votes on pieces of legislation in order to extract concessions. And so it looks like this is what they're trying to do. So the Minnesota Democrats said in an internal survey found that more than 40 progressive caucus members would refuse to vote for the bipartisan bill if it's not accompanied by a bold reconciliation package. So Congresswoman Ilhan Omar said Tuesday that lawmakers in the House's nearly 100-member Progressive Caucus are prepared to withhold their votes from the White House-backed bipartisan infrastructure deal in order to guarantee the concurrent passage of separate bills that invest in climate action, childcare, and other priorities. Speaking to Politico, Omar, the whip of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, said in a recent internal poll of the members showed that 60% of the respondents would be willing to withhold their votes to secure a reconciliation bill, and the Minnesota Democrat noted that 80% of the caucus responded to the survey, so that equals about 40 members that are prepared to stand in the way of a bipartisan infrastructure measure if it is not accompanied by a more ambitious bill. And depending on how many House Republicans ultimately support the bipartisan deal, that level of progressive opposition could be enough to sink the bill. So that's really the big part here, and that's why this is so complicated and why it gets more difficult, is that The problem is the left is always going to be at a disadvantage on pieces of legislation like this that are substantive, that actually will benefit the American people, that actually do tackle things like climate change. We are always going to be at a disadvantage of this. Why are we going to be at a disadvantage? Because Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, the rest of the corporate Democrats, along with the entire Republican Party, they don't give a shit if anything passes. They are perfectly fine having everything fail and maintaining the status quo. That's partially what their job is in Congress. That's why their billionaire donors send them to Congress, is so that they will stand in the way of good pieces of legislation that, like we would be talking about in a partisan bill. So they have no care in the world whether or not the second bill gets passed. So they have no motivation to actually work with us on that second bill. And so that's where it gets kind of complicated, because you can have the 40 members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus withhold their votes, but is that going to be enough? Even if you had Republicans who are also voting on it, I'm not really sure. So they're going to have to do the math on that and make sure that they have enough members in order to successfully block this bipartisan bill if it comes just by itself. So that's a strategy that needs to happen. I'm happy that they're actually seeming to be waking up to this fact. Bernie Sanders also joined in the choir here. He says, "Let me be clear, there will not be a bipartisan infrastructure deal without a reconciliation bill that substantially improves the lives of working families and combats the existential threat of climate change. No reconciliation bill, no deal. We need transformative change now." So listen, what he just said, the crazy part about all of this is what Bernie Sanders just said is what Nancy Pelosi was saying before. And then Republicans came out and they got angry and they were like, you didn't tell us that these bills were going to be tied together. And they got mad and said that they wouldn't do it if they were tied together. So we have two clashing components right now. You have Republicans who are coming to the table and they're saying, we're not going to vote for the bipartisan piece of legislation if it's tied to the partisan one. And then you have progressives who are coming out and saying, we're not going to vote for the bipartisan one unless it is tied to the partisan one. So two competing ideas, but this just gets down to the heart of it. This idea by Joe Biden to bring in the Republican Party on an infrastructure bill in the first place was ridiculous. It never should have happened. They never should have even consulted the Republican Party on their views on this. The American people overwhelmingly want them to pass a big, bold infrastructure plan. And in fact, the things that Joe Biden was so quick to drop, like the increases of taxes on corporations and billionaires, those were actually the most popular parts of the infrastructure bill, according to the polling data on it. So they completely abandoned what the American people actually want in an effort to do this bullshit bipartisanship, where you're not even doing bipartisanship among the American people. You're just doing bipartisanship among corrupt members of our government that answer to their donors instead of answering to their constituents. So you're not actually doing bipartisanship. You're just doing corruption and doing it under the guise of bipartisanship. But listen, Joe Biden is doing this. He's working with Republicans not because he believes in this noble idea of bipartisanship. He's doing it because he agrees with Republicans. Okay, he's doing it because he doesn't really want to have to go out and fight for a good partisan piece of legislation on this issue. So that's why he's doing this, and that's why it seems like he's not willing to drop this, even though it has completely hit a brick wall and is completely falling apart. So progressives, I'm glad they're actually waking up and doing this in the right way. Hopefully they actually stick to their guns and draw red lines in the sand and make demands that are concrete and actionable. And you got to build a coalition. You got to build a coalition, have them stand firm, and refuse to vote for a bipartisan, shitty, watered-down plan unless it comes with something that is significantly more substantial in a partisan way.